Hello and welcome to 100 Great Paintings from Western Art History. My name is J.S. Bird, and this is my third video in the series where we are talking about 10 paintings from the list of my choice for 100 Great Paintings from Western Art History. If you haven't seen Volume 1 and 2, please check it out. I hope you enjoy this video and thanks for being here. We're going to get right to it and start with painting 80, Seated Woman with Fur Collar by Nathan Oliveira from 1961. So in the 60s and 70s, most painters were reacting in some way to abstract expressionism. And one of the things that abstract expressionism did was to loosen up brushwork, to create really aggressive, bold, expressionistic brushwork in an abstract way. And so here we see an artist taking that form, that loose brushwork, and creating imagery with that brushwork. So basically this artist is doing two things at once. He's creating abstract language of brushstroke and color and form and edge, but at the same time, assembling all of that looseness into an image. And he's a master at it. So really big brush strokes, small brush strokes. He uses line, he uses layers. He paints very transparent paint over opaque layers, like on the right bottom side of this painting. He paints opaque paint dragged over opaque paint, like on the left side of this painting. He paints wet in wet, which is basically, let's say you take yellow on your brush and you paint it into green that is already wet in the canvas, and so you make a yellow-green color by mixing the paint on the canvas, not by mixing the paint on the palette. And he does that in really beautiful ways. So we have wet in wet paint, wet over dry paint, dry over dry paint, all in one painting, with a variety of edges, some hard edges, some blurred edges, some blended edges, some edges separated by line. So there's a tremendous vocabulary of brushstroke in this painting, assembled together to make this image in a very aggressive, bold, abstract way. And it's really beautiful, and it is a deceptively difficult way to paint. And Nathan Oliveira was a master at that. Number 79, Gustav Klimt, the Beethoven Frieze from 1902. So this is 7 feet by 112 feet. So in other words, it's painted into this wall in a building in Vienna all the way around the top part of the wall. Thus, it is a frieze. And it tells a story, of course. It goes from the beginning through the middle to the end. And I'm not necessarily here to discuss that story. I am here to discuss the form of the story, the visuality of the story. So we start over here on the left. And of course, one of the things Klimt is known for is using gold leaf. So here we see gold leaf. But I'm really here to talk about two things with Klimt, and that is his shape and his pattern. His shapes are so gorgeous. So he was at a point in art history where he was free to take the human body and turn it into shapes, rather than to try to draw the shapes of the human body. So he could accentuate whatever he wanted to, distort whatever he wanted to, enhance whatever he wanted to, and that he didn't just think about the shapes of the objects in his painting. He thought very definitively about the negative space, the space between the objects of the painting. And that's actually where he put his energy. That's where he put his patterns. That's where he put his work. That's where he put his beauty. So even like that weird arcing gray shape around the night is a weird shape that's full of pattern. That's actually a negative shape. And then the white shape around that night is a very archy pattern. Then notice the shapes of the figures over here on the left, the three figures, how they echo each other, how the belly of the one figure with the red hair echoes the back of the figure with the black hair, and how it creates that negative shape between them, that shape looks just like their body, so that it's echoing those body forms to create that sense of unity and balance between positive and negative. And then as we move into the middle part of the frieze, where he's really enhancing the negative space between those three figures with the pattern. So he's actually more interested in drawing and painting that pattern than he is in the figures. But the pattern makes the figures, and the figure makes the pattern shapes. And then we see the hair of those figures becomes a shape, a black flat shape that is very serpentine and oval, that is then filled with smaller serpentine oval shapes. So he's repeating that idea over and over, right? The oval and the serpentine, the oval and the serpentine. And you can see that in all the forms of this painting, and all of the pattern that he puts into that negative space, that gives that negative space the power. And so we come to this third part here with this dark figure in this cave with this snake. Again, the negative space, the snake and the space above that snake is what gives the painting all its power, that darkness, that energy, that formidable, nightmarish form that figure is surrounded by. And so it just shows the power of negative shape and the power of shape itself, and how those two things, positive and negative shape, can interact to create tremendous and beautiful composition and visual power. '78 Mata, 1941. So 1941, what's going on, people? It is the beginning of World War II, right? And here we have a conflict between the geometric and the organic, a conflict between the reasoned and the unreasoned, a conflict between the light and the dark. So we have all of those super complex, designed, delineated, linear, geometric forms, the reason, right? The logic. And then we have those dark, swirling, blurred, painterly, aggressive organic forms, the emotion, the irrationality, and the sort of conflict, right? The human conflict between those two things, spelled out in paint, in form, in a basically abstract way. So, of course, one of the goals of surrealism was to create a world from dreams, a world from the unconscious, a world from the subconscious, a world that didn't really work the way our world works, the physical world. And he has created this beautifully, where we see this almost landscape, possibly buildings, towers, space, objects, sun, but yet it's none of those things, right? It's just this interplay and conflict between geometric and organic, and the sort of ceaseless battle between those things, or between the logic and the irrationality of humans. Really beautifully done. Number 87, Kazimir Malevich, White on White, 1918. So, here we go. This painting may be very difficult for some of you, or many of you. It's the old, oh, I could do that argument. So I'm going to get to that argument later. But before I get to that, I want to just talk about this painting. So this is 1918. This is like Cubism and post-Cubism and synthetic Cubism and Futurism and post-Impressionism. And this guy is so far ahead of his time, creating minimalism before anybody knew what minimalism even was or could be, or that could even exist. Here's a painter who's thinking, what is the most I can reduce my painting to and still create a painting? So even though it's a rectangle in a rectangle, he has tension. He's tilted that rectangle. He has a figure-ground relationship. He has negative spaces that change, right? All of the different negative spaces around that rectangle are different from each other. He has a dark and a light, even though it's all white. He's tilted that rectangle in such a way that it has a different relationship with all four sides of the canvas. So he's really paying attention formally, by formally I mean visually, to what's actually going on there and creating all the elements that a good formal aesthetic painting has without really having any story. He doesn't have any color. And so he's so far ahead of his time, and I do not believe that Malevich has ever actually gotten the credit that this artist deserves for thinking like this in 1918 when no other artists were thinking like this. This could have been made in 1956 easily and nobody would have batted an eyelash. So that's like a 40-year difference of how far ahead of his time he was. Now, in terms of anybody could make this, well, yes, there are many people that understand paint who could make this. That doesn't really change anything. So, there are many musicians who can play the Beatles. I actually can play some Beatles songs on my bass guitar, but I'm not the Beatles, right? Because other people can reproduce what somebody else did does not change the impact that those originators actually had, right? The impact of the Beatles on music is immeasurable. And because somebody can play that song, that doesn't change it. The impact that Malevich had on how people think about painting is immeasurable. And that doesn't change it because somebody else could recreate it, right? The power is in the originator of the idea. So hold on to that thought. Take that with you. Think about that a little bit. The power is with the originator of the idea. So we're going to move from minimalism to maximalism. Did you catch that? Max Beckmann, Maximalism. The Triptych of the Temptation of St. Anthony. It's even a long title. 1936. So again, pre-war, pre-World War I. And Max Beckmann is interested in jamming as much as possible into his composition. This is the exact opposite of Malevich. How much can I get into a composition and still make it work? How much can I shove in there and still create unity? Like, how much is too much? Now we have a triptych, which of course is based on Gothic altarpieces and goes way back in Western art history. And this painting is based on the story of St. Anthony. But what I want to talk about is how he unifies all of those forms, right? There are multiple people doing multiple things with multiple colors in multiple panels. So the first step is, how do you unify the three panels? How do I make three different paintings go together? And so he's creating that with a U shape. So if you look at this dark figure in the left over here next to the flag, and then down, and then to the woman's leg, the woman with the handcuffs leg, and then over to the reclining figure, which has a rope. There's some kind of a rope or something going down that figure, and then up over under the cushion that woman is sitting on, and then over to the jail cell and the man with the blue suit, his leg, right, takes you back up to the black lines coming from the prison or the cage that other woman is in, that creates a U shape. Can you see that big U shape of dark, right? And that, it becomes a kind of bowl or a container for all of that other stuff to fit in. And that's what we talk about, the unity. How do you hold everything together? And that's done through a lot of dark. You notice that the dark lines are what helps connect all that together and hold all those colors together. Dark and black can be a wonderful matrix, right? A kind of anchor for all of the other colors to live in, so that black moves through all three panels and holds all three panels together. And then, of course, within that U, there's all kinds of other things going on. But because of that connection, that holds all of those other things together. One of the things I would have you all think about, those of you who paint, is how are you holding your rectangle together? What is the unity that holds the rectangle together as one cohesive unit? Or is it just stuff floating randomly around, which is actually visually very chaotic? So we're going to take a little break here, an intermission, and I want to talk a little bit about these videos overall. And one of the things I want to talk about right now is context and how important it is to put a painting in the context of which it was created. So as we look at some beautiful paintings that are going to be discussed in future videos, I want you to think about what would have happened if Van Gogh had painted his paintings in the 14th or 15th century, during the Spanish Inquisition, during the Dark Ages. Of course, Van Gogh would have either been put into an insane asylum or imprisoned, or probably most likely he would have been tortured to death as a heretic for the work that he made, because that did not align with the status quo of making representative paintings based on the Bible, right? He's destroying that motif. What would have happened? Many of you have probably seen Jackson Pollock's drip paintings. What would have happened if Jackson Pollock had made drip paintings in let's say 1890, when Van Gogh was painting? Nobody would have understood it. It wouldn't have made any sense whatsoever in the context of art. Everybody would have just dismissed it. It's the fact that he made it when he made it, thinking about at that time and how that relates to the theory of modern art. And I'll explain that further when we talk about Pollock. But context is so important to the nature of art. How does an artist achieve excellence, but at the same time question and expand the reality of what painting is? Speaking of Goya, which we're looking at right now, how does one expand painting from what it was to something new? And here in this Goya painting, of course, people didn't paint like that then. That is not a representation of the actual world or a mythical or religious story. That's a made-up thing. Artists didn't do that in the 17th century. And this artist has ripped part of it out, cut and burned part of the painting away. Again, questioning what is painting and why is painting the way it is. Does it have to be a rectangle? What if it is ripped? What does that say about the painting? What does that say about the narrative of the painting? Why is he doing it when he's doing it? So whenever you look at work, try to think about the context, or learn about the context of when that painting was made and why it was made the way it was made, and how that changed how people thought about painting. So please, if you like or enjoy these videos, if you're learning anything, if you want to see more, if you want to see where I'm going with other paintings, please like and subscribe. And above all, share these videos with someone who you think might appreciate them. '75, Susan Rothenberg. Cabin Fever, 67 inches by 84 inches from 1976. So this is a fairly large, aggressive, expressive painting. And here we see a painting of a horse, and it is flat, and the inside color and the outside color are extremely similar. So Susan Rothenberg is a wonderful gestural painter. By gestural painter, I mean the way she uses paint strokes, aggressive, bold, expressive paint strokes. And even though she's painting a horse here, Susan Rothenberg is not particularly interested in horses as an idea or as a precious emblem. She's actually using the horse because she is not interested in horses. She is using the horse as a form that she can play with and deconstruct. I believe it is important for the artist to have a certain distance from their subject so that they can see their subject critically as visual information and not as just a thing. So she is not a slave to the shape of a horse. She is actually playing with the shape of a horse. Now, in terms of that shape of the horse, what I really want to talk about with her painting is two things, color and edge. So edge is wherever one thing meets another thing. That could be two brush strokes, that could be two colors, that could be two values, that could be two objects, that could be the positive shape and the negative space. In this case, we're talking about positive shape and negative space. So we see all around that horse there's a kind of edge, and in that edge you might start to notice that each part of it is different than each other part. Sometimes it's fairly well defined, and sometimes it's blurred or blended or lost a little bit. Sometimes it's red against black, and sometimes it's red against red. Sometimes the black shadow is fairly delineated, and sometimes the black shadow is blended and smudged. Sometimes the black shadow is thick, and sometimes it's thin. Sometimes there's a line between the horse and the space, and sometimes there is no line. And sometimes there's a thick line, and sometimes there's a really thin line. So that is being very aware of a vocabulary of edge. Rather than painting one kind of edge, she is painting a wide vocabulary of edge. Sort of like in writing, saying something different each time, rather than saying the same thing over and over again. And along with the variety of edge, there is also a great deal of variety of color. Now you might say, well, that's basically one color. It is. It's kind of a brick color. However, if you really look at it, there's a wide variety of brick color. Sometimes it's redder, sometimes it's oranger, sometimes it's yellower, sometimes it's brighter, sometimes it's grayer or duller. Sometimes it's thick, sometimes it's thin. Sometimes it's blended, sometimes it's brushy. Sometimes the color is on top, sometimes the color comes from underneath. So again, there's a great variety of color, an application of color, even though it's one basic hue, brick. So that is really an artist who is taking some simple issues and expanding the dialogue of those issues really intelligently. And that's something that Susan Rothenberg was really, really good at, and was a major important aspect of modern art and modern painting. Painting 74, Albrecht Dürer. Self-portrait, 1526 by 19. So while the last artist we looked at is deconstructing form, Albrecht Dürer was an artist who was trying to build form. And Dürer was an artist who was obsessed with realism in the sense of painting what the eye sees, not necessarily using one-point perspective or sort of painting each part individually through observation, but painting the entire painting together as one unified piece through observation. So what I mean by that is, in the 15th century, the 14th and 15th century, artists were working towards realism, what we call realism. And oftentimes there was a kind of disjointed quality, so that the artist paints the face, and then the artist paints the cloth, and then the artist paints the chair, and then the artist paints the hand. And so there's a little bit of a disjointedness in much of that work, because each part was painted separately from each other part, as artists were learning how to create the illusion of form. Now in this painting, we can see that Dürer is unifying all of that observation into one cohesive entity. And he's doing that through value and color. So we see that the color is limited. And so by using limited color, the artist focuses on value, the light and dark, right? What we call chiaroscuro or tenebrism, rather than various colors. And so that helps kind of unify the painting. Everything's either some degree of brown or black with some white, right? It's basically white, brown, and black. Some degree of that all over the painting, which unifies the painting and which gives us that sense that it's one form that is being lit, right? Really using light to create form. And so his work is very well observed, and he's mastering oil paint as a medium to use in that observation, but he's also mastering the idea of creating the unity and the unified form and unified light to give that sense of illusion or realism, as we call it. And of course, this is sort of a precursor to Rembrandt and the Baroque period. This is a really beautiful example of an artist sort of approaching it in that way, again, somewhat before his time or ahead of his time. Now, conversely, the next painting, 73 by William Turner, The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, was also an observed painting. He was at this event. This is a historic event. He made sketches. But then when he goes to paint this painting, he is not interested in a direct observational painting. And again, we're looking at how painters changed, how painters thought about painting. And so here we have a precursor to Impressionism. That loose, gestural, broken, layered, strokey brushwork, right? Where he's not trying to make it look like smoke. He is making paint that we interpret as smoke. He's not trying to make it look like fire. He's making paint that we interpret as fire. He's not trying to make it look like water. He's making paint that we read as water and as boats, so forth. So when you really look at the painting, you see that very beginning notion of the idea of the abstract, the idea of that the paint stroke can be as important, if not more important, than the subject. And so he is finding that balance in this piece between painterliness and subject and image, and was one of the pioneers of that way of painting, and certainly ahead of his time and very much a precursor to Impressionism. '72, Pierre Bonnard, The Bathroom, 1932, 47 by 46. That's a pretty big painting for the time. Early modernism, often paintings are not as big as you might expect. At least not as big as I expect. Oftentimes when I see them in a museum, I'm surprised at their size.
Now, we saw Turner as sort of a precursor to Impressionism. Now we're seeing Pierre Bonnard as post-impressionistic, right? Taking the ideas of Impressionism and playing with them even further. Now, when we look at modernism and talk about modernism, there's two major issues that painters were working with for decades that I am going to kind of talk about a lot in this series of videos. One is the idea of the illusion of form versus the flat surface of a painting. That was so monumental in modernism and early modern, because there's an acceptance of the fact that a painting is actually flat and it's made up of paint strokes. It's not a picture. In fact, artists don't need to make pictures anymore because now there are cameras. So artists are free to do something else. And one of those things they did was to play with this idea of form versus flat. And so we see the form of the figure in a foreshortened way against that flat floor, right? Very intentionally flat. Like the floor is not in depth. It is not in perspective. It is flat. Everything would just fall off of that floor. And yet, that figure is very clearly accentuated as a figure in a foreshortened way. And then there are other parts we're kind of living halfway. So that orange part behind the figure that sort of creates that column of the figure is very flat. And then the tile is very flat. But then we see the 1-point perspective on the little table on the left. And so that idea of playing with space intentionally and figuring out how does space and form actually work versus flat paint strokes, and to find a balance between those things. And of course, the second thing, again, starting with Cubism, is the deconstruction of the figure-ground relationship. What is the role of figure-ground? How can I deconstruct it? How can I play with it? And I'm going to go back again to the figure and that orange column behind the figure, and then the diagonal that comes down to the left of that figure, and how that all starts to bleed into one flat shape. But it's not really flat because it's a figure, but it's kind of flat because it also creates that geometric shape that aligns with other geometric shapes. And so where exactly is the figure? The figure is painted in similar colors as the background, as that negative space. And so that idea of sort of deconstructing where figure and where ground are and how we build that relationship was a major tenet of modern painting, and something all painters need to think about. Painting a painting now without understanding the concept of modernism is sort of like practicing physics and ignoring the theory of relativity. You just can't do that, right? You have to understand what has come before and what has happened before so that you can ingest and synthesize those lessons into your own way of thinking about painting. All right, our last painter and painting for this video, 71 Chuck Close, self-portrait, 1997, 106 by 84 inches. So this is a big painting. I always find it interesting that Chuck Close's name is just like his art, because he has always painted very large portraits and puts that portrait close to us, right? That portrait is close to us as a viewer. And if you stand in front of that large painting, you are overwhelmed by the closeness of that portrait. Now, as we zoom in here, you can see that this painting is made up of little patterns, right? It's broken up into a grid, and then the grid is broken up into ovals and circles and weird circular forms, and some of them are painted individually and some of them are combined with other parts of the grid. As we see this picture here of Chuck with the portrait, we get that sense of flesh. Now, how did this happen? So in this black and white portrait, you can see that Chuck Close made in, I believe, in the 60s. He was a photorealist painter in the sense that he wanted to make his paintings look like a photograph, but he painted these paintings by a grid. He made a grid and then he painted each square individually, one after the other. So it became a very formulaic, mathematical almost process. He didn't have to think about where he was going or make adjustments. Just paint each square as it should be painted based on the grid, right? It's just broken down into a grid. And he used an airbrush. Well, then he had, I believe it was a brain aneurysm. And he lost function of his legs and some function of his arms as well. And so he could no longer do that kind of work. And so he arrived at this kind of work. So this is an example of an artist not letting a handicap, and by that I mean, I don't necessarily mean a handicapped person, I mean something that gets in the way of the process, an obstacle, did not let that stop him from making his work. So these large paintings he paints in a wheelchair, one square at a time, from a photograph. He straps the brush, well he did, he died not too long ago, strapped the brush in his hand and paints with his whole arm and makes those loopy colors one square at a time until the entire painting is done. Start in the lower left, work to the upper right, start in the upper right, work to the lower left, whichever way he decides to go. The painting is moved up and down so he's always painting it at the level of his wheelchair. And then step back and voila, you have this portrait. So that's our video for this series of paintings. Thanks again for being here. Let other people know. And please subscribe and like if you appreciate these videos. And leave some comments. What do you think about these paintings? What do you think about this art? What are some of your favorite painters and paintings? What do you think about these particular paintings? Is there anything that you've discovered about them or that you think is cool or that you completely disagree with me about? That would be great. And I'll see you next time.